Section 10 of When God Laughs by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Section 10. The Francis Spaight. A True Tale Retold. The Francis Spaight was running before it solely under a mizzentopsail when the thing happened. It was not due to carelessness so much as to the lack of discipline of the crew and to the fact that they were indifferent seamen at best. The man at the wheel in particular, a Limerick man, had had no experience with salt water beyond that of rafting timber on the Shannon between the Quebec vessels and the shore. He was afraid of the huge seas that rose out of the murk astern and bore down upon him, and he was more given to cowering away from their threatened impact than he was to meeting their blows with the wheel and checking the ship's rush to broach to. It was 3 in the morning when his unseamanlike conduct precipitated the catastrophe. At sight of a sea far larger than its fellows, he crouched down, releasing his hands from the spokes. The Francis Spaight sheered as her stern lifted on the sea, receiving the full fling of the cap on her quarter. The next instant she was in the trough, her lee rail buried till the ocean was level with her hatch combings, sea after sea breaking over her weather rail and sweeping what remained exposed of the deck with icy deluges. The men were out of hand, helpless and hopeless, stupid in their bewilderment and fear, and resolute only in that they would not obey orders. Some wailed, others clung silently in the weather shrouds, and still others muttered prayers or shrieked vile imprecations, and neither captain nor mate could get them to bear a hand at the pumps or at setting patches of sails to bring the vessel up to the wind and sea. Inside the hour the ship was over on her beam ends, the lubberly cowards climbing up her side and hanging on in the rigging. When she went over, the mate was caught and drowned in the after cabin, as were 2 sailors who had sought refuge in the forecastle. The mate had been the ablest man on board, and the captain was now scarcely less helpless than his men. Beyond cursing them for their worthlessness, he did nothing, and it remained for a man named Mahoney, a Belfast man, and a boy, O'Brien, of Limerick, to cut away the fore and mainmasts. This they did at great risk on the perpendicular wall of the wreck, sending the mizzentopmast overside along in the general crash. The Francis Spaight righted, and it was well she was lumber laden, else she would have sunk, for she was already waterlogged. The mainmast, still fast by the shrouds, beat like a thunderous sledge-hammer against the ship's side, every stroke bringing groans from the men. Day dawned on the savage ocean, and in the cold, gray light all that could be seen of the Francis Spaight emerging from the sea were the poop, the shattered mizzenmast, and a ragged line of bulwarks. It was midwinter in the North Atlantic, and the wretched men were half dead from cold. But there was no place where they could find rest. Every sea breached clean over the deck, washing away the salt incrustations from their bodies and depositing fresh incrustations. The cabin under the poop was awash to the knees, but here at least was shelter from the chill wind, and here the survivors congregated, standing upright, holding on by the cabin furnishings, and leaning against one another for support. In vain Mahoney strove to get the men to take turns in watching aloft from the mizzenmast for any chance vessel. The icy gale was too much for them, and they preferred the shelter of the cabin. O'Brien, the boy, who was only 15, took turns with Mahoney on the freezing perch. It was the boy, at 3 in the afternoon, who called down that he had sighted a sail. This did bring them from the cabin, and they crowded the poop rail and weather mizzen shrouds as they watched the strange ship. But its course did not lie near, and when it disappeared below the skyline, they returned to shivering in the cabin, not one offering to relieve the watch at the masthead. By the end of the second day, Mahoney and O'Brien gave up their attempt, and thereafter the vessel drifted in the gale uncared for and without a lookout. There were 13 alive, and for 72 hours they stood knee-deep in the sloshing water of the cabin floor, half frozen, without food, and with but 3 bottles of wine shared among them. All food and fresh water were below, and there was no getting at such supplies in the waterlogged condition of the wreck. As the days went by, no food whatever passed their lips. Fresh water, in small quantities, they were able to obtain by holding a cover of a tureen under the saddle of the mizzenmast. But the rain fell infrequently, and they were hard put. When it rained, they also soaked their handkerchiefs, squeezing them out into their mouths or into their shoes. As the wind and sea went down, they were even able to mop the exposed portions of the deck that were free from brine and so add to their water supply. But food they had none, and no way of getting it, though the seabirds flew repeatedly overhead. In the calm weather that followed the gale, after having remained on their feet for 96 hours, they were able to find dry planks in the cabin on which to lie. But the long hours of standing in the salt water had caused sores to form on their legs. These sores were extremely painful. The slightest contact or scrape caused severe anguish, and in their weak condition and crowded situation they were continually hurting one another in this manner. Not a man could hove about without being followed by volleys of abuse, curses, and groans. So great was their misery that the strong oppressed the weak, shoving them aside from the dry planks to shift for themselves in the cold and wet. The boy, O'Brien, was specially maltreated. Though there were 3 other boys, it was O'Brien who came in for most of the abuse. There was no explaining it, except on the ground that his was a stronger and more dominant spirit than those of the other boys, and that he stood up more for his rights, resenting the petty injustices that were meted out to all the boys by the men. Whenever O'Brien came near the men in search of a dry place to sleep, or merely moved about, he was kicked and cuffed away. In return, he cursed them for their selfish brutishness, and blows and kicks and curses were rained upon him. Miserable as were all of them, he was thus made far more miserable, and it was only the flame of life, unusually strong in him, that enabled him to endure. As the days went by and they grew weaker, their peevishness and ill temper increased, which in turn increased the ill treatment and sufferings of O'Brien. By the 16th day all hands were far gone with hunger, and they stood together in small groups, talking in undertones and occasionally glancing at O'Brien. It was at high noon that the conference came to a head. The captain was the spokesman. All were collected on the poop. "Men," the captain began, "we have been a long time without food. 2 weeks and 2 days it is, though it seems more like 2 years and 2 months. We can't hang out much longer. It is beyond human nature to go on hanging out with nothing in our stomachs. There is a serious question to consider, whether it is better for all to die, or for one to die. We are standing with our feet in our graves. If one of us dies, the rest may live until a ship is sighted. What say you?" Michael Behane, the man who had been at the wheel when the Francis Spaight broached to, called out that it was well. The others joined in the cry. "Let it be one of the boys," cried Sullivan, a Tarbert man, glancing at the same time significantly at O'Brien. "It is my opinion," the captain went on, "that it will be a good deed for one of us to die for the rest." "A good deed, a good deed," the men interjected. "And it is my opinion that 'tis best for one of the boys to die. They have no families to support, nor would they be considered so great a loss to their friends as those who have wives and children." "'Tis right, very right." "Very fit it should be done," the men muttered one to another. But the 4 boys cried out against the injustice of it. "Our lives is just as dear to us as the rest of yez," O'Brien protested, "and our families too. As for wives and childer, who is there savin' meself to care for me old mother that's a widow, as you know well, Michael Behane, that comes from Limerick. 'Tis not fair. Let the lots be drawn between all of us, men and b'ys." Mahoney was the only man who spoke in favor of the boys, declaring that it was the fair thing for all to share alike. Sullivan and the captain insisted on the drawing of the lots being confined to the boys. There were high words, in the midst of which Sullivan turned upon O'Brien, snarling. "'Twould be a good deed to put you out of the way. You deserve it. 'Twould be the right way to serve you, and serve you we will." He started toward O'Brien with intent to lay hands upon him and proceed at once with the killing, while several others likewise shuffled toward him and reached for him. He stumbled backwards to escape them. at the same time crying that he would submit to the drawing of the lots among the boys. The captain prepared 4 sticks of different lengths and handed them to Sullivan.
"You're thinking the drawin'll not be fair," the latter sneered to O'Brien. "So it's yourself'll do the drawin'."
To this O'Brien agreed. A handkerchief was tied over his eyes, blindfolding him, and he knelt down on the deck with his back to Sullivan. "Whoever you name for the shortest stick'll die," the captain said. Sullivan held up one of the sticks. The rest were concealed in his hand, so that none could see whether it was the short stick or not.
"And whose stick will it be?" Sullivan demanded.
"For little Johnny Sheehan,"
O'Brien answered. Sullivan laid the stick aside. Those who looked could not tell if it were the fatal one. Sullivan held up another stick.
"Whose will it be?"
"For George Burns," was the reply.
The stick was laid with the first one, and a third held up.
"And whose is this one?"
"For myself," said O'Brien.
With a quick movement, Sullivan threw the 4 sticks together. No one had seen.
"'Tis for yourself you've drawn it,"
Sullivan announced. "A good deed," several of the men muttered. O'Brien was very quiet. He arose to his feet, took the bandage off, and looked around.
"Where is it?" he demanded. "The short stick, the one for me."
The captain pointed to the 4 sticks lying on the deck.
"How do you know the stick was mine?" O'Brien questioned. "Did you see it, Johnny Sheehan?"
Johnny Sheehan, who was the youngest of the boys, did not answer.
"Did you see it?"
O'Brien next asked Mahoney.
"No, I didn't see it."
The men were muttering and growling.
"'Twas a fair drawin'," Sullivan said. "Ye had your chanst and ye lost, that's all of it."
"A fair drawin'," the captain added. "Didn't I behold it myself? The stick was yours, O'Brien, and ye may as well get ready. Where's the cook? Gorman, come here. Fetch the tureen cover, some of ye. Gorman, do your duty like a man." "But how'll I do it?" the cook demanded. He was a weak-eyed, weak-chinned, indecisive man.
"'Tis a damned murder!" O'Brien cried out.
"I'll have none of it," Mahoney announced. "Not a bite shall pass me lips."
"Then 'tis your share for better men than yourself," Sullivan sneered. "Go on with your duty, cook."
"'Tis not me duty, the killin' of b'ys," Gorman protested irresolutely.
"If yez don't make mate for us, we'll be makin' mate of yourself," Behane threatened. "Somebody must die, and as well you as another."
Johnny Sheehan began to cry. O'Brien listened anxiously. His face was pale. His lips trembled, and at times his whole body shook. "I signed on as a cook," Gorman announced. "And cook I would if galley there was, but I'll not lay me hand to murder. 'Tis not in the articles. I'm the cook."
"And cook you'll be for 1 minute more only," Sullivan said grimly,
at the same moment gripping the cook's head from behind and bending it back till the windpipe and jugular were stretched taut.
"Where's your knife, Mike? Pass it along."
At the touch of the steel, Gorman whimpered. "I'll do it if yez hold the boy." The pitiable condition of the cook seemed in some fashion to nerve up O'Brien.
"It's all right, Gorman," he said. "Go on with it. 'Tis meself knows you're not wantin' to do it. It's all right, sir."
This to the captain, who had laid a hand heavily on his arm.
"You won't have to hold me, sir. I'll stand still."
"Stop your bletherin' and go and get the tureen cover," Behane commanded Johnny Sheehan, at the same time dealing him a heavy cuff along the head. The boy, who was scarcely more than a child, fetched the cover. He crawled and tottered along the deck, so weak was he from hunger. The tears still ran down his cheeks. Behane took the cover from him at the same time administering another cuff. O'Brien took off his coat and bared his right arm. His under lip still trembled, but he held a tight grip on himself. The captain's penknife was opened and passed to Gorman.
"Mahoney, tell me mother what happened to me, if ever ye get back," O'Brien requested.
Mahoney nodded.
"'Tis black murder, black and damned," he said. "The b'y's flesh'll do none of yez any good. Mark me words, ye'll not profit by it, none of yez."
"Get ready," the captain ordered. "You, Sullivan, hold the cover. That's it, close up. Spill nothing. It's precious stuff." Gorman made an effort. The knife was dull. He was weak. Besides, his hand was shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the knife. The three boys were crouched apart, in a huddle, crying and sobbing. With the exception of Mahoney, the men were gathered about the victim, craning their necks to see. "Be a man, Gorman," the captain cautioned. The wretched cook was seized with a spasm of resolution, sawing back and forth with the blade on O'Brien's wrist. The veins were severed. Sullivan held the tureen cover close underneath. The cut veins gaped wide, but no ruddy flood gushed forth. There was no blood at all. The veins were dry and empty. No one spoke. The grim and silent figures swayed in unison with each heave of the ship. Every eye was turned fixedly upon that inconceivable and monstrous thing, the dry veins of a creature that was alive. "'Tis a warnin'," Mahoney cried. "Lave the bye alone. Mark me words, his death'll do none of yez any good." "Try the elbow, the left elbow. 'Tis nearer the heart," the captain said finally, in a dim and husky voice that was unlike his own. "Give me the knife," O'Brien said roughly, taking it out of the cook's hand. "I can't be lookin' at ye puttin' me to hurt." Quite coolly he cut the vein at the left elbow. But, like the cook, he failed to bring blood.
"This is all of no use," Sullivan said. "'Tis better to put him out of his misery by bleedin' him at the throat." The strain had been too much for the lad. "Don't be doin' it," he cried. "There'll be no blood in me throat. Give me a little time. 'Tis cold and weak I am. Be lettin' me lay down and slape a bit. Then I'll be warm and the blood'll flow." "'Tis no use," Sullivan objected. "As if ye could be slapin' at a time like this. Ye'll not sleep and ye'll not warm up. Look at ye now. Ye've an ague." "I was sick at Limerick one night," O'Brien hurried on, "and the doctor couldn't bleed me. But after slapin' a few hours and gettin' warm in bed, the blood came freely. It's God's truth I'm tellin' yez. Don't be murderin' me." "His veins are open now," the captain said. "'Tis no use leavin' him in his pain. Do it now and be done with it." They started to reach for O'Brien, but he backed away. "I'll be the death of yez," he screamed. "Take your hands off of me, Sullivan. I'll come back. I'll haunt yez. Wakin' or slapin', I'll haunt yez till you die."
"'Tis disgraceful," yelled Behane. "If the short stick had been mine, I'd let me mates cut the head off of me and died happy."
Sullivan leaped in and caught the unhappy lad by the hair. The rest of the men followed. O'Brien kicked and struggled, snarling and snapping at the hands that clutched him from every side. Little Johnny Sheehan broke out into wild screaming, but the men took no notice of him. O'Brien was bent backward to the deck, the tureen cover under his neck. Gorman was shoved forward. Some one had thrust a large sheath knife into his hand.
"Do your duty!
Do your duty!" the men cried. The cook bent over, but he caught the boy's eyes and faltered.
"If you don't, I'll kill you with me own hands,"
Behane shouted. From every side a torrent of abuse and threats poured in upon the cook. Still he hung back.
"Maybe there'll be more blood in his veins than O'Brien's,"
Sullivan suggested significantly. Behane caught Gorman by the hair and twisted his head back, while Sullivan attempted to take possession of the sheath knife. But Gorman clung to it desperately. "Let go and I'll do it," he screamed frantically. "Don't be cutting me throat. I'll do the deed. I'll do the deed." "See that you do it then," the captain threatened him. Gorman allowed himself to be shoved forward. He looked at the boy, closed his eyes, and muttered a prayer. Then, without opening his eyes, he did the deed that had been appointed him. O'Brien emitted a shriek that sank swiftly to a gurgling sob. The men held him till his struggles ceased, when he was laid upon the deck. They were eager and impatient, and with oaths and threats they urged Gorman to hurry with the preparation of the meal.
"Lave it, you bloody butchers," Mahoney said quietly. "Lave it, I tell yez. Ye'll not be needin' any of it now. 'Tis as I said, ye'll not be profitin' by the lad's blood. Empty it overside, Behane. Empty it overside."
Behane, still holding the tureen cover in both hands, glanced to windward. He walked to the rail and threw the cover and contents into the sea. A full-rigged ship was bearing down upon them a short mile away. So occupied had they been with the deed just committed that none had had eyes for a lookout. All hands watched her coming on, the brightly coppered forefoot parting the water like a golden knife, the head sails flapping lazily and emptily at each downward surge, and the towering canvas tiers dipping and curtsying with each stately swing of the sea. No man spoke. As she hove to a cable length away, the captain of the Francis Spaight bestirred himself and ordered a tarpaulin to be thrown over O'Brien's corpse. A boat was lowered from the stranger's side and began to pull toward them. John Gorman laughed. He laughed softly at first, but he accompanied each stroke of the oars with spasmodically increasing glee. It was this maniacal laughter that greeted the rescue boat as it hauled alongside and the first officer clambered on board. End of Section 10. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Section 11 of When God Laughs by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Section 11. A Curious Fragment. The capitalist or industrial oligarch, Roger Vanderwater, mentioned in the narrative, has been identified as the ninth in the line of Vanderwaters that controlled for hundreds of years the cotton factories of the South. This Roger Vanderwater flourished in the last decades of the 26th century after Christ, which was the 5th century of the terrible industrial oligarchy that was reared upon the ruins of the early republic. From internal evidences, we are convinced that the narrative which follows was not reduced to writing till the 29th century. Not only was it unlawful to write or print such matter during that period, but the working class was so illiterate that only in rare instances were its members able to read and write. This was the dark reign of the Overman, in whose speech the great mass of the people were characterized as the herd animals. All literacy was frowned upon and stamped out. From the statute books of the times may be instanced that black law that made it a capital offense for any man, no matter of what class, to teach even the alphabet to a member of the working class. Such stringent limitation of education to the ruling class was necessary if that class was to continue to rule. One result of the foregoing was the development of the professional storytellers. These storytellers were paid by the oligarchy, and the tales they told were legendary, mythical, romantic, and harmless. But the spirit of freedom never quite died out, and agitators, under the guise of storytellers, preached revolt to the slave class. That the following tale was banned by the oligarchs we have proof from the records of the Criminal Police Court of Ashbury, wherein, on January 27, 2734, one John Turney, found guilty of telling the tale in a boozing ken of laborers, was sentenced to 5 years penal servitude in the borax mines of the Arizona desert. Editor's note. Listen, my brothers, and I will tell you a tale of an arm. It was the arm of Tom Dixon, and Tom Dixon was a weaver of the first class in a factory of that hellhound and master Roger Vanderwater. This factory was called Hell's Bottom by the slaves who toiled in it, and I guess they ought to know, and it was situated in Kingsbury, at the other end of the town from Vanderwater's summer palace. You do not know where Kingsbury is? There are many things, my brothers, that you do not know, and it is sad. It is because you do not know that you are slaves. When I have told you this tale, I should like to form a class among you for the learning of written and printed speech. Our masters read and write, and possess many books, and it is because of that they are our masters and live in palaces and do not work. When the toilers learn to read and write, all of them, they will grow strong. Then they will use their strength to break their bonds, and there will be no more masters and no more slaves. Kingsbury, my brothers, is in the old state of Alabama. For 300 years the Vanderwaters have owned Kingsbury and its slave pens and factories, and slave pens and factories in many other places and states. You have heard of the Vanderwaters. Who has not? But let me tell you things you do not know about them. The first Vanderwater was a slave, even as you and I. Have you got that? He was a slave, and that was over 300 years ago. His father was a machinist in the slave pen of Alexander Burrell, and his mother was a washerwoman in the same slave pen. There is no doubt about this. I am telling you the truth. It is history. It is printed, every word of it, in the history books of our masters, which you cannot read because your masters will not permit you to learn to read. You can understand why they will not permit you to learn to read when there are such things in the books. They know, and they are very wise. If you did read such things, you might be wanting in respect of your masters, which would be a dangerous thing to your masters. But I know, for I can read, and I am telling you what I have read with my own eyes in the history books of our masters. The first Vanderwater's name was not Vanderwater. It was Vange. Bill Vange, the son of Jurgis Vange, the machinist, and Laura Carnley, the washerwoman. Young Bill Vange was strong. He might have remained with the slaves and led them to freedom. Instead, however, he served the masters and was well rewarded. He began his service when yet a small child as a spy in his home slave pen. He is known to have informed on his own father for seditious utterance. This is fact. I have read it with my own eyes in the records. He was too good a slave for the slave pen. Alexander Burrell took him out, while yet a child, and he was taught to read and write. He was taught many things, and he was entered in the secret service of the government. Of course, he no longer wore the slave dress except for disguise at such times when he sought to penetrate the secrets and plots of the slaves. It was he, when but 18 years of age, who brought that great hero and comrade, Ralph Jacobus, to trial and execution in the electric chair. Of course, you have all heard the sacred name of Ralph Jacobus, but it is news to you that he was brought to his death by the first Vanderwater, whose name was Vange. I know. I have read it in the books. There are many interesting things like that in the books. And after Ralph Jacobus died his shameful death, Bill Vange's name began the many changes it was to undergo. He was known as Sly Vange far and wide. He rose high in the Secret Service, and he was rewarded in grand ways, but still he was not a member of the master class. The men were willing that he should become so. It was the women of the master class who refused to have Sly Vange one of them. Sly Vange gave good service to the masters. He had been a slave himself, and he knew the ways of the slaves. There was no fooling him. In those days the slaves were braver than now, and they were always trying for their freedom. And Sly Vange was everywhere, in all their schemes and plans, bringing their schemes and plans to naught, and their leaders to the electric chair. It was in 2255 that his name was next changed for him. It was in that year that the Great Mutiny took place. In that region west of the Rocky Mountains, 17 millions of slaves strove bravely to overthrow their masters. Who knows if Sly Vange had not lived, but that they would have succeeded? But Sly Vange was very much alive. The masters gave him supreme command of the situation. In 8 months of fighting, 1,350,000 slaves were killed. Vange, Bill Vange, Sly Vange killed them, and he broke the Great Mutiny. And he was greatly rewarded, and so red were his hands with the blood of the slaves that thereafter he was called Bloody Vange. You see, my brothers, what interesting things are to be found in the books when one can read them? And take my word for it, there are many other things even more interesting in the books. And if you will but study with me, in a year's time you can read those books for yourselves. Aye, in 6 months some of you will be able to read those books for yourselves. Bloody Vange lived to a ripe old age, and always to the last was he received in the councils of the masters, but never was he made a master himself. He had first opened his eyes, you see, in a slave pen. But oh, he was well rewarded. He had a dozen palaces in which to live. He who was no master owned thousands of slaves. He had a great pleasure yacht upon the sea that was a floating palace, and he owned a whole island in the sea where toiled 10,000 slaves on his coffee plantations. But in his old age he was lonely, for he lived apart, hated by his brothers, the slaves, and looked down upon by those he had served and who refused to be his brothers. The masters looked down upon him because he had been born a slave. Enormously wealthy he died, but he died horribly, tormented by his conscience, regretting all that he had done and the red stain on his name. But with his children it was different. They had not been born in the slave pen, and by the special ruling of the chief oligarch of that time, John Morrison, they were elevated to the master class. And it was then that the name of Vange disappears from the page of history. It becomes Vanderwater, and Jason Vange, the son of Bloody Vange, becomes Jason Vanderwater, the founder of the Vanderwater line. But that was 300 years ago, and the Vanderwaters of today forget their beginnings and imagine that somehow the clay of their bodies is different stuff from the clay in your body and mine and in the bodies of all slaves. And I ask you, why should a slave become the master of another slave? And why should the son of a slave become the master of many slaves? I leave these questions for you to answer for yourselves, but do not forget that in the beginning the Vanderwaters were slaves. And now, my brothers, I come back to the beginning of my tale to tell you of Tom Dixon's arm. Roger Vanderwater's factory in Kingsbury was rightly named Hell's Bottom, but the men who toiled in it were men, as you shall see. Women toiled there too, and children, little children. All that toiled there had the regular slave rights under the law, but only under the law, for they were deprived of many of their rights by the two overseers of Hell's Bottom, Joseph Clancy and Adolf Munster. It is a long story, but I shall not tell all of it to you. I shall tell only about the arm. It happened that, according to the law, a portion of the starvation wage of the slaves was held back each month and put into a fund. This fund was for the purpose of helping such unfortunate fellow workmen as happened to be injured by accidents or to be overtaken by sickness. As you know with yourselves, these funds are controlled by the overseers. It is the law, and so it was that the fund at Hell's Bottom was controlled by the two overseers of accursed memory. Now Clancy and Munster took this fund for their own use. When accidents happened to the workmen, their fellows, as was the custom, made grants from the fund. But the overseers refused to pay over the grants. What could the slaves do? They had their rights under the law, but they had no access to the law. Those that complained to the overseers were punished. You know yourselves what form such punishment takes. The fines for faulty work that is not faulty, the overcharging of accounts in the company's store, the vile treatment of one's women and children, and the allotment to bad machines whereon, work as one will, he starves. Once the slaves of Hell's Bottom protested to Vanderwater. It was the time of year when he spent several months in Kingsbury. One of the slaves could write. It chanced that his mother could write, and she had secretly taught him as her mother had secretly taught her. So this slave wrote a round robin, wherein was contained their grievances, and all the slaves signed by mark. And with proper stamps upon the envelope, the round robin was mailed to Roger Vanderwater. And Roger Vanderwater did nothing save to turn the round robin over to the two overseers. Clancy and Munster were angered. They turned the guards loose at night on the slave pen. The guards were armed with pick handles. It is said that next day only half of the slaves were able to work in Hell's Bottom. They were well beaten. The slave who could write was so badly beaten that he lived only 3 months. But before he died he wrote once more, to what purpose you shall hear. 4 or 5 weeks afterward, Tom Dixon, a slave, had his arm torn off by a belt in Hell's Bottom. His fellow workmen, as usual, made a grant to him from the fund, and Clancy and Munster, as usual, refused to pay it over from the fund. The slave who could write, and who even then was dying, wrote anew a recital of their grievances, and this document was thrust into the hand of the arm that had been torn from Tom Dixon's body. It now chanced that Roger Vanderwater was lying ill in his palace at the other end of Kingsbury. Not the dire illness that strikes you and me, brothers, just a bit of biliousness, mayhap, or no more than a bad headache because he had eaten too heartily or drunk too deeply. But it was enough for him, being tender and soft from careful rearing. Such men packed in cotton wool all their lives are exceeding tender and soft. Believe me, brothers, Roger Vanderwater felt as badly with his aching head, or thought he felt as badly, as Tom Dixon really felt with his arm torn out by the roots. It happened that Roger Vanderwater was fond of scientific farming, and that on his farm, 3 miles outside of Kingsbury, he had managed to grow a new kind of strawberry. He was very proud of that new strawberry of his, and he would have been out to see and pick the first ripe ones had it not been for his illness. Because of his illness, he had ordered the old farm slave to bring in personally the first box of the berries. All this was learned from the gossip of a palace scullion who slept each night in the slave pen. The overseer of the plantation should have brought in the berries, but he was on his back with a broken leg from trying to break a colt. The scullion brought the word in the night, and it was known that next day the berries would come in, and the men in the slave pen of Hell's Bottom, being men and not cowards, held a council. The slave who could write, and who was sick and dying from the pick-handle beating, said he would carry Tom Dixon's arm. Also, he said he must die anyway, and that it mattered nothing if he died a little sooner. So 5 slaves stole from the slave pen that night after the guards had made their last rounds. One of the slaves was the man who could write. They lay in the brush by the roadside until late in the morning, when the old farm slave came driving to town with the precious fruit for the master. What of the farm slave being old and rheumatic, and of the slave who could write being stiff and injured from his beating, they moved their bodies about when they walked, very much in the same fashion. The slave who could write put on the other's clothes, pulled the broad-brimmed hat over his eyes, climbed upon the seat of the wagon, and drove on to town. The old farm slave was kept tied all day in the bushes until evening, when the others loosed him and went back to the slave pen to take their punishment for having broken bounds. In the meantime, Roger Vanderwater lay waiting for the berries in his wonderful bedroom. Such wonders and such comforts there were that they would have blinded the eyes of you and me who have never seen such things. The slave who could write said afterward that it was like a glimpse of paradise. And why not? The labor and the lives of 10,000 slaves had gone to the making of that bedchamber, while they themselves slept in vile lairs like wild beasts. The slave who could write brought in the berries on a silver tray or platter. You see, Roger Vanderwater wanted to speak with him in person about the berries. The slave who could write tottered his dying body across the wonderful room and knelt by the couch of Vanderwater, holding out before him the tray. Large green leaves covered the top of the tray, and these the body servant alongside whisked away so that Vanderwater could see, and Roger Vanderwater, propped upon his elbow, saw. He saw the fresh, wonderful fruit lying there like precious jewels, and in the midst of it the arm of Tom Dixon as it had been torn from his body, well washed, of course, my brothers, and very white against the blood-red fruit. And also he saw, clutched in the stiff, dead fingers, the petition of his slaves who toiled in Hell's Bottom. "Take and read," said the slave who could write. And even as the master took the petition, the body servant, who till then had been motionless with surprise, struck with his fist the kneeling slave upon the mouth. The slave was dying anyway, and was very weak, and did not mind. He made no sound, and having fallen over on his side, he lay there quietly, bleeding from the blow on the mouth. The physician who had run for the palace guards came back with them, and the slave was dragged upright upon his feet. But as they dragged him up, his hand clutched Tom Dixon's arm from where it had fallen on the floor. "He shall be flung alive to the hounds," the body servant was crying in great wrath. "He shall be flung alive to the hounds." But Roger Vanderwater, forgetting his headache, still leaning on his elbow, commanded silence and went on reading the petition. And while he read there was silence, all standing upright, the wrathful body servant, the physician, the palace guards, and in their midst the slave, bleeding at the mouth and still holding Tom Dixon's arm. And when Roger Vanderwater had done, he turned upon the slave, saying, "If in this paper there be one lie, you shall be sorry that you were ever born." And the slave said, "I have been sorry all my life that I was born." Roger Vanderwater looked at him closely, and the slave said, "You have done your worst to me. I am dying now. In a week I shall be dead, so it does not matter if you kill me now." "What do you with that?" the master asked, pointing to the arm, and the slave made answer, "I take it back to the pen to give it burial. Tom Dixon was my friend. We worked beside each other at our looms." There is little more to my tale, brothers. The slave and the arm were sent back in a cart to the pen, nor were any of the slaves punished for what they had done. Indeed, Roger Vanderwater made investigation and punished the 2 overseers, Joseph Clancy and Adolph Munster. Their freeholds were taken from them. They were branded, each upon the forehead. Their right hands were cut off, and they were turned loose upon the highway to wander and beg until they died. And the fund was managed rightfully thereafter, for a time only, my brothers. For after Roger Vanderwater came his son Albert, who was a cruel master and half mad. Brothers, that slave who carried the arm into the presence of the master was my father. He was a brave man, and even as his mother secretly taught him to read, so did he teach me. Because he died shortly from the pick-handle beating, Roger Vanderwater took me out of the slave pen and tried to make various better things out of me. I might have become an overseer in Hell's Bottom, but I chose to become a storyteller, wandering over the land and getting close to my brothers, the slaves, everywhere. And I tell you stories like this, secretly, knowing that you will not betray me. For if you did, you know as well as I that my tongue will be torn out, and that I shall tell stories no more. And my message is, brothers, that there is a good time coming when all will be well in the world and there will be neither masters nor slaves. But first you must prepare for that good time by learning to read. There is power in the printed word, and here am I to teach you to read, and as well there are others to see that you get the books when I am gone along upon my way, the history books wherein you will learn about your masters, and learn to become strong even as they. Editor's note: from historical fragments and sketches, first published in 50 volumes in 4427, and now, after 200 years because of its accuracy and value, edited and republished by the National Committee on Historical Research. End of section 11. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Section 12 of When God Laughs by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Section 12. A Piece of Steak. With the last morsel of bread, Tom King wiped his plate clean of the last particle of flour gravy and chewed the resulting mouthful in a slow and meditative way. When he arose from the table, he was oppressed by the feeling that he was distinctly hungry. Yet he alone had eaten. The 2 children in the other room had been sent early to bed in order that in sleep they might forget they had gone supperless. His wife had touched nothing, and had sat silently and watched him with solicitous eyes. She was a thin, worn woman of the working class, though signs of an earlier prettiness were not wanting in her face. The flour for the gravy she had borrowed from the neighbor across the hall. The last 2 ha'pennies had gone to buy the bread. He sat down by the window on a rickety chair that protested under his weight, and quite mechanically he put his pipe in his mouth and dipped into the side pocket of his coat. The absence of any tobacco made him aware of his action, and with a scowl for his forgetfulness he put the pipe away. His movements were slow, almost hulking, as though he were burdened by the heavy weight of his muscles. He was a solid-bodied, stolid-looking man, and his appearance did not suffer from being over-prepossessing. His rough clothes were old and slouchy. The uppers of his shoes were too weak to carry the heavy resoling that was itself of no recent date. And his cotton shirt, a cheap 2-shilling affair, showed a frayed collar and ineradicable paint stains. But it was Tom King's face that advertised him unmistakably for what he was. It was the face of a typical prize fighter, of one who had put in long years of service in the squared ring, and by that means developed and emphasized all the marks of the fighting beast. It was distinctly a lowering countenance, and, that no feature of it might escape notice, it was clean shaven. The lips were shapeless and constituted a mouth harsh to excess, that was like a gash in his face. The jaw was aggressive, brutal, heavy. The eyes, slow of movement and heavy-lidded, were almost expressionless under the shaggy, indrawn brows. Sheer animal that he was, the eyes were the most animal-like feature about him. They were sleepy, lion-like, the eyes of a fighting animal. The forehead slanted quickly back to the hair, which, clipped close, showed every bump of a villainous-looking head. A nose twice broken and molded variously by countless blows, and a cauliflower ear, permanently swollen and distorted to twice its size, completed his adornment, while the beard, fresh shaven as it was, sprouted in the skin and gave the face a blue-black stain. Altogether, it was the face of a man to be afraid of in a dark alley or lonely place. And yet Tom King was not a criminal, nor had he ever done anything criminal. Outside of brawls, common to his walk in life, he had harmed no one, nor had he ever been known to pick a quarrel. He was a professional, and all the fighting brutishness of him was reserved for his professional appearances. Outside the ring he was slow going, easy natured, and, in his younger days, when money was flush, too open handed for his own good. He bore no grudges and had few enemies. Fighting was a business with him. In the ring he struck to hurt, struck to maim, struck to destroy, but there was no animus in it. It was a plain business proposition. Audiences assembled and paid for the spectacle of men knocking each other out. The winner took the big end of the purse. When Tom King faced the Woolloomoolloo gouger 20 years before, he knew that the gouger's jaw was only 4 months healed after having been broken in a Newcastle bout. And he had played for that jaw and broken it again in the 9th round, not because he bore the gouger any ill will, but because that was the surest way to put the gouger out and win the big end of the purse. Nor had the gouger borne him any ill will for it. It was the game, and both knew the game and played it. Tom King had never been a talker, and he sat by the window morosely silent, staring at his hands. The veins stood out on the backs of the hands, large and swollen, and the knuckles, smashed and battered and malformed, testified to the use to which they had been put. He had never heard that a man's life was the life of his arteries, but well he knew the meaning of those big upstanding veins. His heart had pumped too much blood through them at top pressure. They no longer did the work. He had stretched the elasticity out of them, and with their distension had passed his endurance. He tired easily now. No longer could he do a fast 20 rounds, hammer and tongs, fight from gong to gong, with fierce rally on top of fierce rally, beaten to the ropes and in turn beating his opponent to the ropes, and rallying fiercest and fastest of all in that last 20th round, with the house on its feet and yelling, himself rushing, striking, ducking, raining showers of blows upon showers of blows, and receiving showers of blows in return, and all the time the heart faithfully pumping the surging blood through the adequate veins. The veins, swollen at the time, had always shrunk down, though each time imperceptibly at first, not quite, remaining just a trifle larger than before. He stared at them, and at his battered knuckles, and for the moment caught a vision of the youthful excellence of those hands before the first knuckle had been smashed on the head of Benny Jones, otherwise known as the Welsh Terror. The impression of his hunger came back on him.
"Blimey, but couldn't I go a piece of steak?"
he muttered aloud, clenching his huge fists and spitting out a smothered oath.
"I tried both Burke's and Solly's," his wife said half apologetically.
"And they wouldn't?"
he demanded.
"Not a ha'penny. Burke said," she faltered.
"G'wan, what'd he say?"
"As how he was thinkin' Sandal'd do ye to night, and as how your score was comfortable big as it was."
Tom King grunted, but did not reply. He was busy thinking of the bull terrier he had kept in his younger days, to which he had fed steaks without end. Burke would have given him credit for 1,000 steaks, then. But times had changed. Tom King was getting old, and old men, fighting before second-rate clubs, couldn't expect to run bills of any size with the tradesmen. He had got up in the morning with a longing for a piece of steak, and the longing had not abated. He had not had a fair training for this fight. It was a drought year in Australia. Times were hard, and even the most irregular work was difficult to find. He had had no sparring partner, and his food had not been of the best nor always sufficient. He had done a few days' navvy work when he could get it, and he had run around the domain in the early mornings to get his legs in shape. But it was hard training without a partner, and with a wife and 2 kiddies that must be fed. Credit with the tradesman had undergone very slight expansion when he was matched with Sandal. The secretary of the Gaiety Club had advanced him £3, the loser's end of the purse, and beyond that had refused to go. Now and again he had managed to borrow a few shillings from old pals, who would have lent more only that it was a drought year and they were hard put themselves. No, and there was no use in disguising the fact, his training had not been satisfactory. He should have had better food and no worries. Besides, when a man is 40, it is harder to get into condition than when he is 20.
"What time is it, Lizzie?"
he asked. His wife went across the hall to inquire and came back.
"8:15.
"They'll be startin' the first bout in a few minutes," he said. "Only a try out. Then there's a 4-round spar 'tween Dealer Wells and Gridley, and a 10-round go 'tween Starlight and some sailor bloke. I don't come on for over an hour."
At the end of another silent 10 minutes he rose to his feet.
"Truth is, Lizzie, I ain't had proper trainin'."
He reached for his hat and started for the door. He did not offer to kiss her. He never did on going out. But on this night she dared to kiss him, throwing her arms around him and compelling him to bend down to her face. She looked quite small against the massive bulk of the man.
"Good luck, Tom," she said. "You gotter do him."
"I gotter do him," he repeated. "That's all there is to it. I just gotter do him."
He laughed with an attempt at heartiness, while she pressed more closely against him. Across her shoulders he looked around the bare room. It was all he had in the world, with the rent overdue, and her and the kiddies, and he was leaving it to go out into the night to get meat for his mate and cubs, not like a modern working man going to his machine grind, but in the old primitive royal animal way, by fighting for it.
"I gotter do him," he repeated, this time a hint of desperation in his voice. "If it's a win, it's 30 quid, and I can pay all that's owin' with a lump o' money left over. If it's a lose, I got not even a penny for me to ride home on the train. The secretaries give all that's comin' from a loser's end. Good bye, old woman. I'll come straight home if it's a win."
"And I'll be waitin' up," she
called to him along the hall. It was full 2 miles to the Gaiety, and as he walked along he remembered how in his palmy days he had once been the heavyweight champion of New South Wales. He would have ridden in a cab to the fight, and how most likely some heavy backer would have paid for the cab and ridden with him. There were Tommy Burns and that Yankee nigger, Jack Johnson. They rode about in motor cars. And he walked. And as any man knew, a hard 2 miles was not the best preliminary to a fight. He was an old 'un, and the world did not wag well with old 'uns. He was good for nothing now except navvy work, and his broken nose and swollen ear were against him even in that. He found himself wishing that he had learned a trade. It would have been better in the long run. But no one had told him, and he knew deep down in his heart that he would not have listened if they had. It had been so easy. Big money, sharp, glorious fights, periods of rest and loafing in between, a following of eager flatterers, the slaps on the back, the shakes of the hand, the toffs glad to buy him a drink for the privilege of 5 minutes' talk, and the glory of it, the yelling houses, the whirlwind finish, the referee's "King wins," and his name in the sporting columns next day. Those had been times, but he realized now in his slow, ruminating way that it was the old 'uns he had been putting away. He was youth, rising, and they were age, sinking. No wonder it had been easy. They, with their swollen veins and battered knuckles, and weary in the bones of them from the long battles they had already fought. He remembered from the time he put out old Stowsher Bill at Rushcutter's Bay in the 18th round, and how old Bill had cried afterward in the dressing room like a baby. Perhaps old Bill's rent had been overdue. Perhaps he'd had at home a missus and a couple of kiddies. And perhaps Bill, that very day of the fight, had had a hungering for a piece of steak. Bill had fought game and taken incredible punishment. He could see now, after he had gone through the mill himself, that Stowsher Bill had fought for a bigger stake that night 20 years ago than had young Tom King, who had fought for glory and easy money. No wonder Stowsher Bill had cried afterward in the dressing room. Well, a man had only so many fights in him to begin with. It was the iron law of the game. One man might have 100 hard fights in him, another man only 20. Each, according to the make of him and the quality of his fibre, had a definite number, and when he had fought them he was done. Yes, he had had more fights in him than most of them, and he had had far more than his share of the hard, grueling fights, the kind that worked the heart and lungs to bursting, that took the elastic out of the arteries and made hard knots of muscle out of youth's sleek suppleness, that wore out nerve and stamina, and made brain and bones weary from excess of effort and endurance overwrought. Yes, he had done better than all of them. There were none of his old fighting partners left. He was the last of the old guard. He had seen them all finished, and he had had a hand in finishing some of them. They had tried him out against the old uns, and one after another he had put them away, laughing when, like old Stowsher Bill, they cried in the dressing room. And now he was an old un, and they tried out the youngsters on him. There was that bloke Sandal. He had come over from New Zealand with a record behind him, but nobody in Australia knew anything about him, so they put him up against old Tom King. If Sandal made a showing, he would be given better men to fight, with bigger purses to win, so it was to be depended upon that he would put up a fierce battle. He had everything to win by it, money and glory and career, and Tom King was the grizzled old chopping block that guarded the highway to fame and fortune. And he had nothing to win except 30 quid to pay the landlord and the tradesmen. And as Tom King thus ruminated, there came to his stolid vision the form of youth, glorious youth, rising exultant and invincible, supple of muscle and silken of skin, with heart and lungs that had never been tired and torn, that laughed at limitation and effort. Yes, youth was the nemesis. It destroyed the old uns, and recked not that in so doing it destroyed itself. It enlarged its arteries and smashed its knuckles, and was in turn destroyed by youth. For youth was ever youthful. It was only age that grew old. At Castlereagh Street he turned to the left, and 3 blocks along came to the Gaiety. A crowd of young larrikins hanging outside the door made respectful way for him, and he heard one say to another, "That's him. That's Tom King." Inside, on the way to his dressing room, he encountered the secretary, a keen-eyed, shrewd-faced young man who shook his hand. "How are you feeling, Tom?" he asked. "Fit as a fiddle," King answered, though he knew that he lied, and that if he had a quid he would give it right there for a good piece of steak. When he emerged from the dressing room, his seconds behind him, and came down the aisle to the squared ring in the centre of the hall, a burst of greeting and applause went up from the waiting crowd. He acknowledged salutations right and left, though few of the faces did he know. Most of them were the faces of kiddies unborn when he was winning his first laurels in the squared ring. He leaped lightly to the raised platform and ducked through the ropes to his corner, where he sat down on a folding stool. Jack Ball, the referee, came over and shook his hand. Ball was a broken-down pugilist who for over 10 years had not entered the ring as a principal. King was glad that he had him for referee. They were both old uns. If he should rough it with Sandal a bit beyond the rules, he knew Ball could be depended upon to pass it by. Aspiring young heavyweights, one after another, were climbing into the ring and being presented to the audience by the referee. Also, he issued their challenges for them. "Young Pronto," Bill announced, "from North Sydney, challenges the winner for £50 side bet." The audience applauded and applauded again as Sandal himself sprang through the ropes and sat down in his corner. Tom King looked across the ring at him curiously, for in a few minutes they would be locked together in merciless combat, each trying with all the force of him to knock the other into unconsciousness. But little could he see, for Sandal, like himself, had trousers and sweater on over his ring costume. His face was strongly handsome, crowned with a curly mop of yellow hair, while his thick, muscular neck hinted at bodily magnificence. Young Pronto went to one corner and then the other, shaking hands with the principals and dropping down out of the ring. The challenges went on. Ever youth climbed through the ropes, youth unknown but insatiable, crying out to mankind that with strength and skill it would match issues with the winner. A few years before, in his own heyday of invincibleness, Tom King would have been amused and bored by these preliminaries, but now he sat fascinated, unable to shake the vision of youth from his eyes. Always were these youngsters rising up in the boxing game, springing through the ropes and shouting their defiance, and always were the old uns going down before them. They climbed into success over the bodies of the old uns. And ever they came, more and more youngsters, youth unquenchable and irresistible. And ever they put the old uns away, themselves becoming old uns and travelling the same downward path, while behind them, ever pressing on them, was youth eternal, the new babies, grown lusty and dragging their elders down, with behind them more babies to the end of time. Youth that must have its will, and that will never die. King glanced over to the press box and nodded to Morgan of the Sportsman and Corbett of the Referee. Then he held out his hands while Sid Sullivan and Charlie Bates, his seconds, slipped on his gloves and laced them tight, closely watched by one of Sandel's seconds, who first examined critically the tapes on King's knuckles. A second of his own was in Sandel's corner, performing a like office. Sandel's trousers were pulled off, and as he stood up, his sweater was skinned off over his head. And Tom King, looking, saw youth incarnate, deep-chested, heavy-thewed, with muscles that slipped and slid like live things under the white satin skin. The whole body was a-crawl with life, and Tom King knew that it was a life that had never oozed its freshness out through the aching pores during the long fights wherein youth paid its toll and departed not quite so young as when it entered. The two men advanced to meet each other, and as the gong sounded and the seconds clattered out of the ring with the folding stools, they shook hands and instantly took their fighting attitudes. And instantly, like a mechanism of steel and springs balanced on a hair trigger, Sandel was in and out and in again, landing a left to the eyes, a right to the ribs, ducking a counter, dancing lightly away and dancing menacingly back again. He was swift and clever. It was a dazzling exhibition. The house yelled its approbation. But King was not dazzled. He had fought too many fights and too many youngsters. He knew the blows for what they were, too quick and too deft to be dangerous. Evidently Sandel was going to rush things from the start. It was to be expected. It was the way of youth, expanding its splendor and excellence in wild insurgence and furious onslaught, overwhelming opposition with its own unlimited glory of strength and desire. Sandel was in and out, here, there, and everywhere, light-footed and eager-hearted, a living wonder of white flesh and stinging muscle that wove itself into a dazzling fabric of attack, slipping and leaping like a flying shuttle from action to action through 1,000 actions, all of them centered upon the destruction of Tom King, who stood between him and fortune. And Tom King patiently endured. He knew his business, and he knew youth now that youth was no longer his. There was nothing to do till the other lost some of his steam, was his thought, and he grinned to himself as he deliberately ducked so as to receive a heavy blow on the top of his head. It was a wicked thing to do, yet eminently fair according to the rules of the boxing game. A man was supposed to take care of his own knuckles, and, if he insisted on hitting an opponent on the top of the head, he did so at his own peril. King could have ducked lower and let the blow whiz harmlessly past, but he remembered his own early fights and how he smashed his first knuckle on the head of the Welch Terror. He was but playing the game. That duck had accounted for one of Sandel's knuckles. Not that Sandel would mind it now. He would go on superbly regardless, hitting as hard as ever throughout the fight. But later on, when the long ring battles had begun to tell, he would regret that knuckle and look back and remember how he smashed it on Tom King's head. The first round was all Sandel's, and he had the house yelling with the rapidity of his whirlwind rushes. He had overwhelmed King with avalanches of punches, and King did nothing. He never struck once, contenting himself with covering up, blocking and ducking, and clinching to avoid punishment. He occasionally feinted, shook his head when the weight of a punch landed, and moved stolidly about, never leaping or springing or wasting an ounce of strength. Sandel must foam the froth of youth away before discreet age could dare to retaliate. All King's movements were slow and methodical, and his heavy-lidded, slow-moving eyes gave him the appearance of being half asleep or dazed. Yet they were eyes that saw everything, that had been trained to see everything through all his 20 years and odd in the ring. They were eyes that did not blink or waver before an impending blow, but that coolly saw and measured distance. Seated in his corner for the minute's rest at the end of the round, he lay back with outstretched arms, his arms resting on the right angle of the ropes, his chest and abdomen heaving frankly and deeply as he gulped down the air driven by the towels of his seconds. He listened with closed eyes to the voices of the house.
"Why don't you fight, Tom?" many were crying. "You ain't afraid of him, are you?"
"Muscle bound," he heard a man on a front seat comment. "He can't move quicker. 2-1 on Sandal in quids." The gong struck and the two men advanced from their corners. Sandal came forward fully 3/4 of the distance, eager to begin again, but King was content to advance the shorter distance. It was in line with his policy of economy. He had not been well trained, and he had not had enough to eat, and every step counted. Besides, he had already walked 2 miles to the ringside. It was a repetition of the first round, with Sandal attacking like a whirlwind, and with the audience indignantly demanding why King did not fight. Beyond feinting with several slowly delivered and ineffectual blows, he did nothing save block and stall and clinch. Sandal wanted to make the pace fast, while King, out of his wisdom, refused to accommodate him. He grinned with a certain wistful pathos on his ring-battered countenance, and went on cherishing his strength with the jealousy of which only age is capable. Sandal was youth, and he threw his strength away with the munificent abandon of youth. To King belonged the ring generalship, the wisdom bred of long, aching fights. He watched with cool eyes and head, moving slowly and waiting for Sandal's froth to foam away. To the majority of the onlookers it seemed as though King was hopelessly outclassed, and they voiced their opinion in offers of 3-1 on Sandal. But there were wise ones, a few, who knew King of old time, and who covered what they considered easy money. The third round began as usual, one-sided, with Sandal doing all the leading and delivering all the punishment. A half-minute had passed when Sandal, overconfident, left an opening. King's eyes and right arm flashed in the same instant. It was his first real blow. A hook, with the twisted arch of the arm to make it rigid, and with all the weight of the half-pivoted body behind it. It was like a sleepy-seeming lion suddenly thrusting out a lightning paw. Sandal, caught on the side of the jaw, was felled like a bullock. The audience gasped and murmured awe-stricken applause. The man was not muscle-bound after all, and he could drive a blow like a trip-hammer. Sandal was shaken. He rolled over and attempted to rise, but the sharp yells from his seconds to take the count restrained him. He knelt on one knee, ready to rise, and waited while the referee stood over him, counting the seconds loudly in his ear. At the 9th he rose in fighting attitude, and Tom King, facing him, knew regret that the blow had not been an inch nearer the point of the jaw. That would have been a knockout, and he could have carried the 30 quid home to the missus and the kiddies. The round continued to the end of its 3 minutes. Sandal, for the first time, respectful of his opponent, and King slow of movement and sleepy-eyed as ever. As the round neared its close, King, warned of the fact by sight of the seconds crouching outside ready for the spring in through the ropes, worked the fight around to his own corner. And when the gong struck, he sat down immediately on the waiting stool, while Sandal had to walk all the way across the diagonal of the square to his own corner. It was a little thing, but it was the sum of little things that counted. Sandal was compelled to walk that many more steps, to give up that much energy, and to lose a part of the precious minute of rest. At the beginning of every round, King loafed slowly out from his corner, forcing his opponent to advance the greater distance. The end of every round found the fight maneuvered by King into his own corner so that he could immediately sit down. 2 more rounds went by in which King was parsimonious of effort and Sandal prodigal. The latter's attempt to force a fast pace made King uncomfortable, for a fair percentage of the multitudinous blows showered upon him went home. Yet King persisted in his dogged slowness, despite the crying of the young hotheads for him to go in and fight. Again, in the 6th round, Sandal was careless. Again, Tom King's fearful right flashed out to the jaw, and again Sandal took the 9 seconds count. By the 7th round, Sandal's pink of condition was gone, and he settled down to what he knew was to be the hardest fight in his experience. Tom King was an old 'un, but a better old 'un than he had ever encountered. An old 'un who never lost his head, who was remarkably able at defense, whose blows had the impact of a knotted club, and who had a knockout in either hand. Nevertheless, Tom King dared not hit often. He never forgot his battered knuckles, and knew that every hit must count if the knuckles were to last out the fight. As he sat in his corner, glancing across at his opponent, the thought came to him that the sum of his wisdom and Sandel's youth would constitute a world's champion heavyweight. But that was the trouble. Sandel would never become a world champion. He lacked the wisdom, and the only way for him to get it was to buy it with youth, and when wisdom was his, youth would have been spent in buying it. King took every advantage he knew. He never missed an opportunity to clinch, and in effecting most of the clinches his shoulder drove stiffly into the other's ribs. In the philosophy of the ring, a shoulder was as good as a punch so far as damage was concerned, and a great deal better so far as concerned expenditure of effort. Also, in the clinches, King rested his weight on his opponent, and was loath to let go. This compelled the interference of the referee, who tore them apart, always assisted by Sandel, who had not yet learned to rest. He could not refrain from using those glorious flying arms and writhing muscles of his, and when the other rushed into a clinch, striking shoulder against ribs, and with head resting under Sandel's left arm, Sandel almost invariably swung his right behind his own back into the projecting face. It was a clever stroke, much admired by the audience, but it was not dangerous, and was therefore just that much wasted strength. But Sandel was tireless and unaware of limitations, and King grinned and doggedly endured. Sandel developed a fierce right to the body, which made it appear that King was taking an enormous amount of punishment, and it was only the old ringsters who appreciated the deft touch of King's left glove to the other's biceps just before the impact of the blow. It was true, the blow landed each time, but each time it was robbed of its power by that touch on the biceps. In the 9th round, 3 times inside a minute, King's right hooked its twisted arch to the jaw, and 3 times Sandel's body, heavy as it was leveled to the mat. Each time he took the 9 seconds allowed him and rose to his feet, shaken and jarred, but still strong. He had lost much of his speed, and he wasted less effort. He was fighting grimly, but he continued to draw upon his chief asset, which was youth. King's chief asset was experience. As his vitality had dimmed and his vigor abated, he had replaced them with cunning, and with wisdom born of the long fights, and with a careful shepherding of strength. Not alone had he learned never to make a superfluous movement, but he had learned how to seduce an opponent into throwing his strength away. Again and again, by feint of foot and hand and body, he continued to inveigle Sandel into leaping back, ducking, or countering. King rested, but he never permitted Sandel to rest. It was the strategy of age. Early in the 10th round, King began stopping the other's rushes with straight lefts to the face, and Sandel, grown wary, responded by drawing the left, then by ducking it and delivering his right in a swinging hook to the side of the head. It was too high up to be vitally effective, but when first it landed, King knew the old familiar descent of the black veil of unconsciousness across his mind. For the instant, or for the slightest fraction of an instant, rather, he ceased. In the one moment he saw his opponent ducking out of his field of vision and the background of white watching faces. In the next moment he again saw his opponent and the background of faces. It was as if he had slept for a time and just opened his eyes again, and yet the interval of unconsciousness was so microscopically short that there had been no time for him to fall. The audience saw him totter and his knees give, and then saw him recover and tuck his chin deeper into the shelter of his left shoulder. Several times Sandel repeated the blow, keeping King partially dazed. Then the latter worked out his defense, which was also a counter. Feinting with his left, he took a half step backward, at the same time uppercutting with the whole strength of his right. So accurately was it timed that it landed squarely on Sandel's face in the full downward sweep of the duck, and Sandel lifted in the air and curled backward, striking the mat on his head and shoulders. Twice King achieved this, then turned loose and hammered his opponent to the ropes. He gave Sandel no chance to rest or to set himself, but smashed blow upon blow until the house rose to its feet and the air was filled with an unbroken roar of applause. But Sandel's strength and endurance were superb, and he continued to stay on his feet. A knockout seemed certain, and a captain of police, appalled at the dreadful punishment, arose by the ringside to stop the fight. The gong struck for the end of the round, and Sandell staggered to his corner, protesting to the captain that he was sound and strong. To prove it, he threw 2 back air springs, and the police captain gave in. Tom King, leaning back in his corner and breathing hard, was disappointed. If the fight had been stopped, the referee perforce would have rendered him the decision, and the purse would have been his. Unlike Sandell, he was not fighting for glory or career, but for 30 quid. And now Sandell would recuperate in the minute of rest. Youth will be served. This saying flashed into King's mind, and he remembered the first time he had heard it, the night when he had put away Stowsher Bill. The toff who had bought him a drink after the fight and patted him on the shoulder had used those words. Youth will be served. The toff was right. And on that night, in the long ago, he had been Youth. Tonight, Youth sat in the opposite corner. As for himself, he had been fighting for half an hour now, and he was an old man. Had he fought like Sandell, he would not have lasted 15 minutes. But the point was that he did not recuperate. Those upstanding arteries and that sorely tried heart would not enable him to gather strength in the intervals between the rounds. And he had not had sufficient strength in him to begin with. His legs were heavy under him and beginning to cramp. He should not have walked those 2 miles to the fight. And there was the steak which he had got up longing for that morning. A great and terrible hatred rose in him for the butchers who had refused him credit. It was hard for an old man to go into a fight without enough to eat. And a piece of steak was such a little thing, a few pennies at best, yet it meant 30 quid to him. With the gong that opened the 11th round, Sandell rushed, making a show of freshness which he did not really possess. King knew it for what it was, a bluff as old as the game himself. He clinched to save himself, then, going free, allowed Sandell to get set. This was what King desired. He feinted with his left, drew the answering duck and swinging upward hook, then made the half-step backward, delivered the uppercut full to the face, and crumpled Sandell over to the mat. After that he never let him rest, receiving punishment himself, but inflicting far more, smashing Sandell to the ropes, hooking and driving all manner of blows into him, tearing away from his clinches or punching him out of attempted clinches, and ever when Sandell would have fallen, catching him with one uplifting hand, and with the other immediately smashing him into the ropes where he could not fall. The house by this time had gone mad, and it was his house, nearly every voice yelling, "Go it, Tom! Get him! Get him!" "You got him, Tom! You got him!" It was to be a whirlwind finish, and that was what a ringside audience paid to see. And Tom King, who for half an hour had conserved his strength, now expended it prodigally in the one great effort he knew he had in him. It was his one chance, now or not at all. His strength was waning fast, and his hope was that before the last of it ebbed out of him, he would have beaten his opponent down for the count. And as he continued to strike and force, coolly estimating the weight of his blows and the quality of the damage wrought, he realized how hard a man Sandell was to knock out. Stamina and endurance were his to an extreme degree, and they were the virgin stamina and endurance of youth. Sandell was certainly a coming man. He had it in him. Only out of such rugged fiber were successful fighters fashioned. Sandell was reeling and staggering, but Tom King's legs were cramping and his knuckles going back on him. Yet he steeled himself to strike the fierce blows, every one of which brought anguish to his tortured hands. Though now he was receiving practically no punishment, he was weakening as rapidly as the other. His blows went home, but there was no longer the weight behind them, and each blow was the result of a severe effort of will. His legs were like lead, and they dragged visibly under him, while Sandell's backers, cheered by this symptom, began calling encouragement to their man. King was spurred to a burst of effort. He delivered 2 blows in succession, a left, a trifle too high, to the solar plexus, and a right cross to the jaw. They were not heavy blows, yet so weak and dazed was Sandell that he went down and lay quivering. The referee stood over him, shouting the count of the fatal seconds in his ear. If before the 10th second was called he did not rise, the fight was lost. The house stood in hushed silence. King rested on trembling legs. A mortal dizziness was upon him, and before his eyes the sea of faces sagged and swayed, while to his ears, as from a remote distance, came the count of the referee. Yet he looked upon the fight as his. It was impossible that a man so punished could rise. Only Youth could rise, and Sandel rose. At the 4th second he rolled over on his face and groped blindly for the ropes. By the 7th second he had dragged himself to his knee, where he rested his head, rolling groggily on his shoulders. As the referee cried 9, Sandel stood upright in proper stalling position, his left arm wrapped about his face, his right wrapped about his stomach. Thus were his vital points guarded, while he lurched forward toward King in the hope of effecting a clinch and gaining more time. At the instant Sandel arose, King was at him, but the 2 blows he delivered were muffled on the stalled arms. The next moment Sandel was in the clinch and holding on desperately, while the referee strove to drag the 2 men apart. King helped to force himself free. He knew the rapidity with which Youth recovered, and he knew that Sandel was his if he could prevent that recovery. One stiff punch would do it. Sandel was his, indubitably his. He had out-generaled him, out-fought him, out-pointed him. Sandel reeled out of the clinch, balanced on the hairline between defeat or survival. One good blow would topple him over and down and out. And Tom King, in a flash of bitterness, remembered the piece of steak, and wished that he had it then behind that necessary punch he must deliver. He nerved himself for the blow, but it was not heavy enough nor swift enough. Sandel swayed, but did not fall, staggering back to the ropes and holding on. King staggered after him, and with a pang like that of disillusion, delivered another blow. But his body had deserted him. All that was left of him was a fighting intelligence that was dimmed and clouded from exhaustion. The blow that was aimed for the jaw struck no higher than the shoulder. He had willed the blow higher, but the tired muscles had not been able to obey. And from the impact of the blow, Tom King himself reeled back and nearly fell. Once again he strove. This time his punch missed altogether, and from absolute weakness he fell against Sandel and clinched, holding on to him to save himself from sinking to the floor. King did not attempt to free himself. He had shot his bolt. He was gone. And Youth had been served. Even in the clinch he could feel Sandel growing stronger against him. When the referee thrust them apart, there before his eyes he saw Youth recuperate. From instant to instant Sandel grew stronger. His punches, weak and futile at first, became stiff and accurate. Tom King's bleared eyes saw the gloved fist driving at his jaw, and he willed to guard it by interposing his arm. He saw the danger, willed the act, but the arm was too heavy. It seemed burdened with 100 weight of lead. It would not lift itself, and he strove to lift it with his soul. Then the gloved fist landed home. He experienced a sharp snap that was like an electric spark, and simultaneously the veil of blackness enveloped him. When he opened his eyes again, he was in his corner, and he heard the yelling of the audience like the roar of the surf at Bondi Beach. A wet sponge was being pressed against the base of his brain, and Sid Sullivan was blowing cold water in a refreshing spray over his face and chest. His gloves had already been removed, and Sandel, bending over him, was shaking his hand. He bore no ill will toward the man who had put him out, and he returned the grip with a heartiness that made his battered knuckles protest. Then Sandel stepped to the center of the ring, and the audience hushed its pandemonium to hear him accept young Pronto's challenge and offer to increase the side bet to £100. King looked on apathetically while his seconds mopped the streaming water from him, dried his face, and prepared him to leave the ring. He felt hungry. It was not the ordinary gnawing kind, but a great faintness, a palpitation at the pit of the stomach that communicated itself to all his body. He remembered back into the fight, to the moment when he had Sandel swaying and tottering on the hairline balance of defeat. Ah, that piece of steak would have done it. He had lacked just that for the decisive blow, and he had lost. It was all because of the piece of steak. His seconds were half supporting him as they helped him through the ropes. He tore free from them, ducked through the ropes unaided, and leaped heavily to the floor, following on their heels as they forced a passage for him down the crowded center aisle. Leaving the dressing room for the street, in the entrance to the hall, some young fellow spoke to him.
"Why'n't you go in and get him when you had him?" the young fellow asked.
"Oh, go to hell," said Tom King, and passed down the steps to the sidewalk.
The doors of the public house at the corner were swinging wide, and he saw lights and the smiling barmaids, heard the many voices discussing the fight and the prosperous chink of money on the bar. Somebody called to him to have a drink. He hesitated perceptibly, then refused and went on his way. He had not a copper in his pocket, and the 2-mile walk home seemed very long. He was certainly getting old. Crossing the domain, he sat down suddenly on a bench, unnerved by the thought of the missus sitting up for him, waiting to learn the outcome of the fight. That was harder than any knockout, and it seemed almost impossible to face. He felt weak and sore, and the pain of his smashed knuckles warned him that, even if he could find a job at navvy work, it would be a week before he could grip a pick handle or a shovel. The hunger palpitation at the pit of the stomach was sickening. His wretchedness overwhelmed him, and into his eyes came an unwonted moisture. He covered his face with his hands, and as he cried, he remembered Stowsher Bill, and how he had served him that night in the long ago. Poor old Stowsher Bill! He could understand now why Bill had cried in the dressing room. End of A Piece of Steak. End of When God Laughs, by Jack London. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com